Welcome back, everyone. This is our lecture on sub-Saharan Africa today. One of the things that is important to remember when we discuss the archaeology of Africa is that it is a remarkably enormous geographic space. The continent is larger than the United States, China, and Australia combined. And elevations range from below sea level to over 16,000 feet in elevation. Rainfall varies from massive amounts in the tropics to virtually nothing in areas like the Sahara and the Kalahari. And temperatures range from freezing in some of the higher mountain ranges along the eastern Rift Valley area to some of the hottest on the planet. Seasonal fluctuations, especially the monsoon rains, define a wet and dry season cycle to many areas of the continent, as well as the normal temperature variations that you would see. An interesting feature is that even more so than South America, Africa sits squarely astride the equator. And so if you look at different parts of the continent, from the northern Mediterranean coast of Africa and compare that to the Cape region of South Africa in the south, different seasons are happening simultaneously on different parts of the continent. You have both summer and winter, or spring and fall, simultaneously in these different areas. And the northern part of the continent is north of the Tropic of Cancer, and the southern part is south of the Tropic of Capricorn. And so truly non-tropical areas, and so with your standard seasonality that you see there, but flipped from northern and southern hemispheres. It's also important to remember that not only do we have the origins of very early hominids in Africa, but anatomically or behaviorally modern humans are found here far earlier than anywhere else. One recently excavated example is that of Panga Saidi Cave in Kenya, and it dates as far back as 78,000 years ago. And what's particularly interesting about this isn't just that date in particular, but that the late Stone Age assemblages, including microlithic tool assemblages, these composite tool kits, bone beads, shell beads, all kinds of really fantastic things. And of particular note is the presence of these red ochre crayons dating at least 48,000 years old, which makes them far older than any of the rock art that we see and hear talked about a great deal from the famous painted caves of Western Europe. But people were doing these things and demonstrating that fully modern behavioral, fully modern cognition in Africa at a much earlier date. Here's some of these artifacts I was mentioning there, the bone artifacts, the red ochre paint palette there, the beads, the microliths, and a location showing this near the coast north of Mombasa in modern-day Kenya. So behaviorally modern humans are found archaeologically first in Africa. Bringing it closer to ourselves in time, looking at the early and middle Holocene between about 10 and 5,000 years ago, up to the end of the African humid period that we talked about at the beginning of our lecture on Egypt, all across the continent you have intensified hunting, gathering, and fishing. Developments of fishhooks and harpoons and all number of intensified hunting and gathering technologies and behaviors are seen very widespread. And the populations expanded northward into the wet Sahara during this time period. You also see these epic traditions of rock art, especially in southern Africa, but all over. And they really, truly represent one of the most remarkable early artistic traditions of humanity. And you should really check out this website that I have linked here, African Rock Art, done by the British Museum, with all that implies. But it's a remarkably well done website that catalogs, and you can search by country and region and time period. So check that out if you get a chance. Here's just a few examples. This is a remarkable panel from Postmasburg in South Africa, showing these elands. And the shading and coloration on these is truly, truly beautiful, even though these are incredibly ancient. Here's some from Botswana, showing an ibex and what appears to be a young ibex there, painted in red, a very common color that you see in quite a bit of parietal art, rock art, in different parts of the world. This next one is just stunning in terms of the complexity and the number of different figures that you see on this. And this is from the site of Motoko in Zimbabwe. And you can see that this runs the gamut from, there's both domesticated animals here as well as wild animals. There's fish, there's zebras, there's snakes, there's leopards. This is a lot to unpack, but just to show these aren't kind of isolated creations that are very small, and you can see the background there. You see those enormous, almost ghostly elephants that the rest of this is overpainted onto. Another really interesting one is the Linton panel. Unfortunately was removed from its original location back in 1918 and is now in the National Museum of South Africa. And you can see these very impressive anthropomorphic figures on here, along with some of the other wildlife. But what's really, I think, important and special about this one is that the current coat of arms of the modern nation of South Africa, post-apartheid South Africa, actually borrowed one of the figures from the Linton panel and includes it in the coat of arms of the nation. And so this is, I think, certainly worthy of note to show this link to the past on their modern coat of arms. And recalling, I think, some of that really ancient hunting and gathering tradition as well through the art. What's particularly interesting when we look at the early transitions to other modes of subsistence is that in Africa we actually see transitions to herding very, very early. And there is almost certainly an indigenous domestication of cattle centered in the Sahara region during this African humid period that we've been discussing. And it predates farming in many regions, especially north of the equator and east of the Rift Valley. And it's important that we have this archaeological evidence supporting a local domestication that preceded any introduction from outside the continent. This is a local tradition and likely occurred during that in the wet Sahara, and see the sites of Bir Kaseba and Nabta Playa that's discussed in your text. These people were herding cattle, harvesting wild grasses like sorghum, and developing some of the earliest ceramics in the world. What's really fascinating is that there is pottery earlier in Mali, in northwest Africa, at the site of Onjugu, that is over 11,000 years old. 9,400 BCE is the date they've placed on this. And this is significantly older than Near Eastern ceramic traditions. The only place that you see ceramics older than this is in Northeast Asia and Japan in the Jomon traditions. And so Africa has a precocious development of that technology that is so critical to these early developments in human society, and Africa has one of the earliest forms of it anywhere. What's also interesting is that you see in addition to the high genetic diversity of the local populations of domesticated cattle, The local breeds, especially of the humpless cattle in West Africa, are resistant to harsh climates and tropical diseases. And this suggests a long period of residence and development of these varieties. And there's a later introduction of different genetic strains, like the Zebu cattle with the hump. Uh, these are introduced later from South Asia, India, and Pakistan region, and their genetic mix is now found in many herds of cattle throughout Africa, but they represent a later introduction of that. So, farming, in the sense of growing fields of plants in Africa, has a number of indigenous domestications as well, including pearl millet and sorghum, that we see in the archaeological record as early as 2400 BCE in the Tilemsi Valley of Mali. Again, there in West Africa, very early developments of these crops. You also see West African rice and yams, probably domesticated by at least 2000 BCE in and around Nigeria. One of the difficulties that is often encountered by archaeologists working, especially in warm tropical regions, is that much of the paleobotanical remains do not survive particularly well in these environments. Combine that with the fact that many areas of Africa have seen much less archaeological research than the Near East or Egypt or Rome or Greece. And one can easily understand why many of these dates that we're going to be discussing here in this lecture are more approximate. And we talk about the earliest that has been found, because many scholars suspect that there's even earlier evidence out there. We just either haven't figured out how to recover that information, or the sites just haven't been excavated yet. But again, over 4,000 years of this domestication. Now, as a little side thing, this is a yam. This is a Fulani woman carrying a freshly harvested yam. Many of the things that get called yams in the United States are not. If you think yams are orange in color, that's not a yam. That's a sweet potato. You can see here on this slide, you've got a yam on the right, a sweet potato on the left. And for your further edification on the matter, I have a chart here that shows you how you can figure out if the thing that you're looking at is a yam or a sweet potato. Most of the things that we're familiar with here in the United States are in fact sweet potatoes, and so native to the New World, native to South America, domesticated here, as opposed to the African yam. Both of them are delicious. Both of them used in a wide variety of cuisines in their respective areas, but I think both of them deserving of their proper names. My favorite one on here is it bigger than a guinea pig? And if the answer is yes, then it's probably a yam. And if it's bigger than a pug, then it's definitely a yam. That was my favorite way to distinguish. Moving on. During this early period of agricultural development, one of the other things that you see is the development of remarkably early ironworking. The Nok of West Africa, especially the area around Nigeria, were some of the earliest ironworking populations. And it is almost certain that ironworking was another local development within Africa. In fact, some of the earliest steel may be manufactured in Africa. And you can also see that the Nok ceramic artistry is remarkably well developed. And if you think about it, it makes a fair amount of sense. Being able to effectively control the temperatures of a ceramic kiln and get those temperatures to increase and decrease in a controlled fashion so that you're able to produce these fine, detailed works of ceramic art is something that would connect directly with the ability to do things like smelt metals. Because the ability to create metallic iron in a way that can be used in blacksmithing and hammering out things like these spear blades and other tools is not actually melting it down, because then you get this oxidation that produces cast iron as opposed to metallic iron. And so there's a more complex process of being able to get the temperature high enough to be able to smelt the metal without actually liquefying it. And that's something that isn't going to happen just tossing something into a fire. These were incredibly skilled workers, and their ability to control fire and heat is on obvious display here. One of the other things to talk about is the Bantu expansion. This is a major event in the history of the African continent, and resulted in the ancestral populations of many of the tribes of Central and Southern Africa today arriving in their new homelands. This was a large-scale population movement that began in West Equatorial Africa, possibly as early as 2500 BCE. So a fair amount of time has elapsed. But what really seems to have been one of the major catalysts for this was a forest crisis. As the Sahel grasslands expanded southward, and other groups were pushed south as the Sahara grew ever larger. Many of these were these early farming and herding populations that had been displaced by climate change. And as they get pushed south into the margins of the forest, they encounter other groups, many of them combining some of their different traditions of ironworking and yam farming and millet and sorghum and ceramics. And this process then leads to the formation of a very widespread Bantu tradition. These were ironworking farmers. And the whole process lasted a long time, but individual groups were migrating rapidly, including some like the Urue, who moved nearly 2,000 miles southward in East Africa, from Kenya to South Africa, in less than 200 years. These were not sort of the things where, oh, you are 5 miles away from where you started, by each generation. Those time average things that you hear people talking about does not appear to be how the Bantu expansion happened. This happened with people looking for new lands, looking for new homes, and moving out there and using their skill in ironworking and farming and herding and ceramics and all of the knowledge that they had built up over millennia to very effectively find new homelands for their people. I'm going to briefly touch on some of the Nilotic states south of Egypt here. For one, you have the site of the early state of Kerma. I have the map of the Nile turned 90 degrees counterclockwise here. But if you look here on the map, you've got Lower Egypt on the left, Upper Egypt in the middle, Kush in the south, the Nubian Desert. And if you look right there, before the Big Bend, you have the third cataract of the Nile, and you can see the location of Kerma right there. It was founded around 2500 BCE and has monumental architecture, massive cemetery complexes, centralized political and spiritual authority. Unfortunately, relatively little research has been conducted up to this point, other than excavating some of the monumental architecture near the center of the site. It appears to have fallen victim to the imperial expansion of New Kingdom Egypt, and the site is abandoned around 1800 BCE. This is one of the larger structures at the site called the Western Defufa, and appears to have been a mud brick temple structure near the center of the site. Another one, especially the two cities of Napata and Meroe, which were the capitals of the Kingdom of Kush. And you can see Napata there near the fourth cataract, there around that first big bend, and then Meroe, again around another bend, all the way towards the right of the slide here. This kingdom of Kush was clearly influenced in some aspects, especially in its mortuary architecture. You can see here by its northern neighbor Egypt, but it was distinctly its own state. These were the Nubians that conquered Egypt in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, and the 25th dynasty of Egypt is actually from the kingdom of Kush. While this state moved its capital to Meroe in the 4th century BCE, as a political unit, it actually outlasted the pharaohs. And you can see here's another view of one of the necropoli, the city of the dead, these mortuary temples. A unfortunately poorly understood history in terms of the details. We don't have anywhere near the details about Kush that we do for Egypt, and it's a real shame because there's some fascinating things. They have an incredibly beautiful tradition of pottery. You can see here this little frog. On the top right over there, you can see this beautiful papyrus landscape being illustrated on these vessels. And what else is really, really interesting is that Meroitic writing can be read. In other words, we can sound it out, but the language of the writing is not understood. And so there's a whole literary tradition that if it could be deciphered, if we could figure out how to read it, if we could figure out what language this is in, it would open up a whole nother body of truly indigenous African literature. Finally, for today, I'm going to talk about the site of Great Zimbabwe. This was once the subject of a great deal of racist speculation by Europeans who could not imagine that native Africans were capable of such urbanism and the creation of such a large city. This is the source of some of the racist European stories of the White Queen of Sheba living in a city down here. Obviously, this has as much basis as any of the other nonsense that we've talked about, from the mound builders of North America to any number of the other space alien-like traditions. We now know in 2020 that from West Africa, see Genegeno in your textbook. East Africa, you can look again also in the textbook at Aksum in Ethiopia, and even the middle of the Libyan desert. I was fascinated by that site of Old Jarma. Really recommend reading up on that section. That state formation and urbanism was widespread and developed in situ in many regions of the mother continent. And Great Zimbabwe is a classic example of this pattern. Here's a map. You can see located in southeastern part of the African continent, south of the Zambezi and north of the Limpopo rivers. Great Zimbabwe was built by the ancestors of the Shona people, who are one of the people that we talked about, the Bantu expansion. The Shona are one of the Bantu peoples that migrated from equatorial West Africa southward into this region sometime before about 1,000 or 2,000 years ago. It appears to have been built as an impressive palace and ritual space. There's a number of archaeoastronomical alignments here at Great Zimbabwe that certainly had significance, not only for their calendric purposes, but for their spiritual and symbolic meanings as well. And the residential structures inside the main portion of the citadel were the residences of the elites of the community, but the community that was part of the Great Zimbabwe urbanism were much more extensive and spread across square kilometers of the surrounding landscape. The part illustrated here in these next few slides is just the central palatial and ceremonial core. It's not the whole city by any means. Here you can see an example of some of the construction that they're using here. A very substantial stone wall with some remarkable masonry construction here. And you can note there's even artistry into how the stone is being laid. Here's an artist's reconstruction of what these various platforms inside the great enclosure of Great Zimbabwe may have looked like at the time that they were occupied. So what are some of the roots of the rise and fall of Great Zimbabwe? Well, undoubtedly there was the successful mixed agriculture in the region had something to do with it. It's incredibly fertile. It's very fertile ground. It gets a fair amount of rainfall. And the combination of herding and indigenous agriculture combined with some of those new varieties of cattle coming in through the Indian Ocean trade routes undoubtedly provided a subsistence basis for large, dense populations in this area. But what created the economic, social, and political patterns that enabled the state of Great Zimbabwe to maintain itself? There was flourishing trade in iron, copper, salt, and especially in gold and ivory. And the key here is these trade networks with cities of the Indian Ocean coast. Persian and even Chinese ceramics and glass from Turkey have been found by archaeologists working at Great Zimbabwe. So it was absolutely part of the larger world system. What brought about its downfall? Well, in many instances, we see this quite frequently in examinations of the ancient world. Likely environmental stress combined with global economic fluctuations in luxury item demand likely were part of the decline and abandonment of the city. As the value of gold and ivory increase or decrease, this could have caused economic crises. And if a number of different crises overlap and occur at the same time, even well-organized state-level societies can have difficulty dealing with them. However, the descendants of the inhabitants, the Shona, still live and thrive in the area and carry on the heritage of this ancient African state. Well, I hope this has been informative for our examination of Holocene Africa, and I look forward to talking with you guys again very soon. Have a wonderful day.